I always say that I never sang any style of music that I hadn't heard in my household growing up. I can't approach it with any kind of authenticity.
At 78 years old, Linda Ronstadt stands as one of the most decorated voices in American music history. Her career has spanned decades, crossed genres, and earned her countless accolades. Yet behind the platinum records, sold-out arenas, and critical acclaim lies a series of professional conflicts that shaped not just her career trajectory, but her approach to collaboration and trust within the music industry. While Ronstadt has maintained a largely dignified public presence throughout her life, there are moments in her story when the mask slipped, moments when the interactions with fellow musicians left scars that influenced how she conducted herself for years to come. This is the story of 7 musicians who crossed paths with Linda Ronstadt in ways that tested her patience, challenged her professionalism, and ultimately revealed the human side of a legendary artist. Linda Ronstadt's journey to stardom was anything but conventional. Coming of age in the late 1960s, she emerged from the Stone Ponies with a hit single and the determination to forge her own path. By the early 1970s, she had established herself as a serious musician with broad appeal and exceptional vocal talent. But success in the music industry of that era came with a price. It required navigating a landscape dominated by ego, artistic temperament, and the complex politics of who deserved credit for whose success. Ronstadt learned these lessons quickly, sometimes painfully, through her interactions with some of rock and roll's most celebrated figures. Don Henley and the Eagles. The story of Don Henley and the Eagles remains one of the most fascinating examples of how patronage in the music industry can curdle into something far less noble. In 1971, when Linda Ronstadt was assembling a backing band for her tour, she took a chance on 2 young, largely unknown musicians named Don Henley and Glenn Frey. At that time, neither man had achieved any significant success. Henley was playing drums and providing harmonies, while Frey contributed guitar work. The tour also featured Randy Meisner and Bernie Leadon, but it was Ronstadt's name, reputation, and musical credibility that opened doors for all of them. She provided them with invaluable experience, exposure to industry professionals, and the kind of visibility that money cannot buy. By the end of that tour, Henley and Frey had made connections, gained confidence, and most importantly, had found each other as creative partners. Ronstadt watched as Henley and Frey left to form their own group, and she supported their decision wholeheartedly. She even encouraged industry contacts to pay attention to their new venture. This was an act of genuine generosity from an artist who could have viewed them as competitors or attempted to keep them within her orbit. Instead, she released them into the world with her blessing. What happened next would become the stuff of music industry legend. The Eagles exploded onto the scene with seemingly effortless success. Take It Easy, Desperado, One of These Nights, and eventually the Juggernaut Hotel California established them as one of the most important rock bands of the decade. They achieved a level of commercial and critical success that few artists ever reach. However, as their fame ascended, Henley's attitude toward Ronstadt shifted noticeably. In interviews during the mid-1970s, he began to distance himself from his early days as a backing musician. More troubling, he made pointed comments about Ronstadt's musical approach, suggesting that her sound was too safe and too polished, lacking the raw edge that he and the Eagles had cultivated. For someone like Ronstadt, who valued artistic integrity and took pride in her craft, these comments felt like a betrayal not just of their professional relationship, but of the gratitude that might have been expected from someone she had given such a significant opportunity. The situation escalated when Ronstadt discovered that Henley had been using her name and reputation to access venues and exclusive events where his presence was not warranted. He had reportedly attempted to use her credibility as a way to gain entry to spaces and opportunities that he had not earned on his own merit. When Ronstadt learned of this, she took action. She revoked his backstage credentials and made it clear that he would no longer be welcome at her shows. This was not a public confrontation or a dramatic gesture made for the cameras. Rather, it was a quiet, professional boundary drawn by an artist who understood that respect had to be mutual. What many people failed to appreciate at the time was the extent of Ronstadt's influence on the Eagles' early sound. Her touring style, her approach to vocal layering, her stage discipline. These were not lost on the young musicians watching her work. Glenn Frey himself acknowledged in later interviews that much of what the Eagles learned about harmony came from observing Ronstadt in the studio and on stage. Yet Henley seemed determined to create a narrative in which the Eagles were self-made, as if their early days learning from one of the finest musicians of their generation were somehow beneath them or needed to be forgotten. Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison was at the height of his mystique and chaos when his path intersected with Linda Ronstadt in the late 1960s. By 1968, the Doors had established themselves as one of rock music's most provocative and unpredictable forces. Morrison's reputation for spontaneous on-stage behavior, sometimes brilliant, often disturbing, preceded him. What Ronstadt encountered during their brief professional intersection was not the poetic rebel of mythology, but a man whose substance abuse and disturbing behavior toward women were becoming impossible to ignore. The incident that left the deepest impression occurred when Ronstadt was performing as a featured artist, with her set in full swing before a substantial audience. Morrison, watching from the wings, decided without any warning or consent to walk on stage and grab Ronstadt, attempting to pull her into an unwanted kiss in front of thousands of people. It was not a romantic gesture or a spontaneous moment of artistic passion. It was a violation. Ronstadt handled the moment with remarkable composure, stopping the performance, extracting herself from his grasp, and continuing professionally. But the humiliation was real, and the violation was profound. Here was a respected artist, in control of her own performance, suddenly having that control wrested away by a man who viewed her as a prop in his personal theater of excess. What made the situation worse was that Morrison did not see this as problematic. Instead, weeks later, he gave a radio interview in which he disparaged Ronstadt, calling her sweet but spineless, and suggesting that her music lacked fire. He mocked her for not standing up for herself, seemingly oblivious to the irony that the very event he was indirectly referencing, where she had indeed stood up for herself by rejecting his advances, contradicted his own assessment. His comments spread through the industry and the emerging music press, and they stung Ronstadt deeply, not because she believed them, but because they came from someone with significantly more cultural power and visibility than she possessed at that moment. Ronstadt's response was to build her career with methodical determination, to strengthen her stage presence, and to become increasingly selective about which artists she would collaborate with or appear alongside. She did not engage Morrison in a public battle of words. She did not try to defend herself through interviews or statements. Instead, she simply became more successful, more respected, and more careful about protecting herself from people who viewed other artists as objects to be used. Morrison's own trajectory would prove cautionary. His addiction worsened, his erratic behavior became more pronounced, and within a few years, he was dead at 27, leaving behind a complicated legacy of brilliance tainted by exploitation and abuse. Neil Young. By the mid-1970s, Linda Ronstadt had achieved the kind of commercial and critical success that most artists only dream about. She was one of the most respected voices in rock music, known for her versatility, her technical skill, and her ability to move audiences across multiple genres. Neil Young, in his own right, was equally respected as an artist, and had positioned himself as a voice of political consciousness and artistic authenticity. When both artists found themselves on the bill for a politically charged benefit concert in 1976, focused on supporting farm workers' rights, it seemed like a natural convergence of artistic vision and social responsibility. What happened behind the scenes at that benefit revealed something troubling about the music industry's gender politics and creative hierarchies. Young had a very specific vision for how protest music should sound: urgent, raw, emotionally unpolished, stripped of the commercial sensibilities that he associated with mainstream appeal. Ronstadt's approach, by contrast, was rooted in her belief that music with professional polish and refined vocal performance could still carry political weight and move people to action. Her voice, her training, her commitment to excellence were not limitations of her artistry. They were features of it. Young, however, saw things differently. Behind the scenes during rehearsals, he made it clear that he viewed Ronstadt's performance style as too commercial for the political nature of the event. He questioned whether her polished approach was appropriate for a protest concert. He did not engage with her as a peer or collaborate with her suggestions. Instead, he dismissed her concerns and her artistic vision without genuine dialogue. For Ronstadt, who had dedicated herself to supporting causes she believed in, and who had always approached collaboration with respect for other artists' work, this treatment felt like both a professional and personal rejection. The aftermath of that concert was not marked by headlines or public accusations. Instead, Ronstadt made a quiet strategic decision. She became more selective about the political causes she would lend her name and presence to. She did not abandon activism, but she shifted her approach. She began directing her efforts toward behind-the-scenes funding and support of causes she believed in, rather than putting herself on stages where she might face similar dismissal or condescension. In a way, Young's dismissal of her contributions led her to find a different kind of power, the power to effect change without needing public validation or approval from artists who did not understand the breadth of her artistic vision. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa occupied a unique place in the rock music landscape of the 1970s. He was undeniably brilliant, a virtuoso composer and musician who refused to compromise his artistic vision for commercial appeal. He was also, by nearly all accounts, extraordinarily difficult to work with. When Ronstadt approached him in 1970 for about a potential collaboration that would blend rock, jazz, and avant-garde elements, both artists seemed like they might have something valuable to offer each other. Ronstadt's vocal prowess and versatility could have been a perfect vehicle for Zappa's complex arrangements. Instead, what occurred was a masterclass in how creative genius does not necessarily correlate with the ability to treat other artists with basic respect. From the first moment in the studio, Zappa approached the session as a test rather than a collaboration. He ran the sessions with absolute autocratic control. When Ronstadt offered ideas about phrasing or vocal approaches, contributions that came from a place of professional expertise and artistic judgment, Zappa did not engage with them respectfully. Instead, he reportedly laughed at her suggestions in front of the entire band. He mocked her tone and implied that she lacked the understanding necessary to handle his complex arrangements. For a woman who had spent years developing her craft, who had proven herself countless times over, this treatment was not just unprofessional. It was humiliating. Ronstadt did not stay to finish the session. She walked out, and there was no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, no public airing of grievances. She simply removed herself from a situation that was not serving her artistically or emotionally. The tapes from that session were shelved and never released. Zappa, for his part, used the experience to reinforce his belief that pop artists were fundamentally incapable of handling serious music. He never publicly acknowledged that the real issue was not Ronstadt's ability, but his own unwillingness to treat her as a peer. What is often overlooked in this story is that Ronstadt's response to this experience actually changed how she approached her own work. She became known for creating studio environments that were collaborative, respectful, and welcoming to different ideas. She took risks that Zappa would have never considered, moving into opera, mariachi, and big band music, always on her own terms, and always with professionals who treated her with the respect she deserved. In many ways, her later career stands as a rebuke to Zappa's narrow vision of what serious music could be and who was capable of making it. David Crosby. The Laurel Canyon music scene of the early 1970s was built on a sense of community and mutual support among artists. David Crosby, as a member of the Byrds and later Crosby, Stills and Nash, was an integral part of that world. He and Ronstadt moved in the same circles, appeared at the same events, and shared a mutual respect rooted in their commitment to musical excellence. Or so Ronstadt believed. That changed in 1975 during a rehearsal for a benefit concert, when Crosby suggested a key change for a group performance. Ronstadt, being protective of her voice and knowing what her vocal range could handle, politely declined. It was not a major issue. It was the kind of small disagreement that happens in collaborative musical situations all the time. Crosby, however, took her response as a personal rejection. A few weeks later, in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, he delivered what amounted to a public attack on Ronstadt's entire career. He called her manufactured and suggested that her success was a product of studio engineering rather than genuine talent. For an artist with Crosby's stature and influence, this was not merely an opinion expressed casually. It was a deliberate attempt to damage Ronstadt's credibility. What made it especially painful for Ronstadt was that it came from someone she had considered a friend, someone she had collaborated with and supported, someone who should have understood the amount of hard work and genuine talent that had gone into building her career. Ronstadt's response was to withdraw. She did not issue a public counterstatement or attempt to defend herself in the press. Instead, she quietly but decisively cut ties with Crosby. She removed him from her professional circle, declined collaborations that would have included him, and made it clear that she would no longer be working with him. Her decision to pull out of a planned studio session that would have included Crosby had real consequences. The session had to be completely reworked, and the dynamics were fundamentally altered. Her absence was noted by producers and other musicians, and it sent a message. Disrespect had consequences, and Ronstadt was not willing to tolerate it in the name of community or history. Crosby continued with his career, but the aftermath of his comments seemed to follow him. Other musicians pointed out that his behavior was part of a larger pattern of being difficult and dismissive. His substance abuse issues during this period only compounded the problems in his professional relationships. Years later, Crosby would admit in interviews that he had made mistakes during this era of his life. But by then, the damage with Ronstadt was done. The trust was broken, and it would never be fully repaired. Ronstadt, meanwhile, proved that Crosby's assessment of her was spectacularly wrong. She went on to win Grammy Awards, undertake ambitious artistic projects across multiple genres, and establish a legacy that extended far beyond the boundaries of what Crosby had considered legitimate or serious music. Elvis Costello. In 1979, Elvis Costello represented everything that was new and vital in rock music. He was part of the punk and new wave movements that were challenging the established order. Linda Ronstadt, with her polished sound, her commercial success, and her genre-crossing approach, represented exactly what Costello and his peers were rebelling against. When Ronstadt was performing as a headliner at a major festival in Cleveland, Costello was also on the bill. After Ronstadt finished a strong set, Costello made comments to reporters backstage, dismissing her performance as background music for brunch. It was a deliberate insult, designed not just to critique her music, but to position her as irrelevant to the new direction that rock music was supposedly taking. Ronstadt was informed of the comment, and, rather than let it slide, confronted Costello backstage. This was not the response Costello expected. Rather than engaging in a conversation or explaining himself, he doubled down on his insult and walked away. For Ronstadt, who had been dealing with the egos and insecurities of the music industry for years, this incident was notable for its sheer disrespect and its casual dismissal of her entire body of work. What happened next was not a public feud or a trading of barbs in the press. Instead, Ronstadt made a strategic decision about her professional life. She began declining events and festivals where confrontational or dismissive artists were prominent. She was not afraid of Costello or anyone like him. Rather, she was making a choice to protect her peace and her focus. Shortly after this incident, she recorded an album of traditional Mexican music, a move that demonstrated her independence from the trends and judgments of the moment. The album was critically acclaimed and introduced her to new audiences who appreciated her willingness to take artistic risks. Years later, Costello attempted to soften his stance and suggested that his younger self had been arrogant and overly critical. But an apology never came, and the incident in Cleveland remained a defining moment in their relationship, or rather, the lack thereof. What Costello never fully understood was that Ronstadt's background music for brunch would ultimately prove far more enduring and beloved than whatever punk credibility he was so desperate to protect. Paul Simon. By 1982, the idea of a collaboration between Linda Ronstadt and Paul Simon seemed like a natural meeting of two major artistic forces. Simon was famous for his meticulous songwriting, his poetic lyrics, and his ability to construct sophisticated musical arrangements. Ronstadt brought her unparalleled vocal ability and her proven capacity to interpret songs across multiple genres. The music world eagerly anticipated what these two artists might create together. But what unfolded in the studio would become a cautionary tale about the difference between perfectionism and respect. From the beginning of the sessions, it became clear that Simon was operating under a very specific model of collaboration. He was in control and everyone else, including Ronstadt, was expected to fit into his vision. Every suggestion Ronstadt made was met with resistance. Every attempt to bring her own interpretive skills to the songs was redirected or dismissed. What should have been an exciting and stimulating creative environment became increasingly tense and uncomfortable. Ronstadt found herself being asked to suppress her own artistic instincts and to adapt herself to fit Simon's exacting specifications. The sessions dragged on, filled with friction and frustration. Simon's need for control extended to trying to reshape Ronstadt's natural vocal style to fit his predetermined vision. For an artist who had spent her entire career developing her voice and her artistry, who had always valued collaboration and mutual respect, this was deeply demoralizing. More than that, it felt like a violation of her artistic agency. The project became a battle of wills, and eventually, Ronstadt reached a point where she had to ask herself whether continuing was worth the emotional and creative cost. The duet was never finished. The track was never released. The music world was left wondering what might have been, but for Ronstadt, the unfinished project represented something more important, a clear understanding of what she would and would not accept in her professional collaborations. She had given Simon a chance, had approached the project with openness and professionalism, and had been met with dismissal and control. The experience confirmed something she had been learning throughout her career. She did not need to work with anyone who did not respect her as an artist. Simon continued his career with success and accolades, but his reputation as a difficult and controlling collaborator became increasingly recognized in industry circles. For Ronstadt, the failed collaboration served as a defining moment. She recognized her own value, understood her right to be treated with respect, and made clear that there were certain kinds of working relationships she would simply no longer accept, no matter how prestigious the artist or how tempting the opportunity. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.